This is a key question for everybody involved in the international peace studies to know if this is really a crisis that should be understood and discussed at the Security Council level, or if it's just for the UN or other bodies. So the idea for today is like basically we want like to achieve three main objectives. We want to analyze the basic concepts and theories, and that's why this will be more of an academic event. We want to have this interchange of ideas. And we want to have a discussion about it. So if any of you, while the presenters are doing their presentation, have any questions, please write them on the chat. It will be open, and we will have a box for a Q&A. So if you are connected in your computer, you can go to the bottom part and you will see a Q&A bottom. So you can use that also to add your questions. And at the end of the session, we will have a time to make that discussion very livid and interesting. And the final part, or the last objective that we will like to achieve today, is to have a list maybe of the main obstacles in achieving a unified and effective response by the UN Security Council or other political bodies of the UN that can be involved in understanding and addressing the Venezuelan crisis. So before giving the floor to our presenters, I would like to give the floor to Vivi Borges from CEPAS. She will give a brief words.
Okay. Thank you, Maria Teresa, and it's an honor and a pleasure to hold this event together with the University for Peace, especially in this moment, like it's so complex and where there's no clarity or certainty about the solution to the crisis in Venezuela. As an organization that defends human rights in Venezuela, we have for some years wanted to more discussion about the role of political bodies in United Nations, and especially the Security Council on the multidimensional crisis in Venezuela. We believe that the analysis of peace, the peace and security agenda and the situation in Venezuela is a very little known topic and should be analyzed more in the international discussion about Venezuela. Today is the first activity of what we want to be continuous debate that incorporates an academic perspective. We think that we need the academic field involved in the crisis in Venezuela. That is why I'm very grateful to have the support of the University for Peace. And we believe that the political bodies of the United Nations play an important role in the crisis in Venezuela, and it's essential to have in how to do in a most effective way. And it's important that Venezuela stay and remain on the international agenda. And for this, the correct use and the understanding in a better way to the international law is necessary because it's a situation of great human suffering and complexity. I would like to thank Maria Teresa, Pablo, Sara, Jorge, Veronica, and all the team that gave their support to organize this event, and all the excellent panelists that we have today that I'm so excited to hear. And thank you very much for joining us in this discussion. And I will give the floor to Maria Teresa, who will have the challenge of moderating this interesting conversation. Thank you, everybody. And I hope we have a wonderful morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivi, for your words. On behalf of UPeace, we have a short video from our dean, Dr. Juan Carlos Sainz. He's also Venezuelan. He couldn't join us because he's in Africa, and with the time difference, it's quite difficult for him to join. But I will present a video that he sent us. So you will be able to see it right now and listen to his words.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Carlos Sainz. I'm the Dean of the University for Peace, and I'm here to say a couple of words about this very interesting event about the role of the Security Council and other UN bodies in the Venezuelan situation. Is the humanitarian and political crisis in Venezuela a threat to the international peace and security? First of all, I'm so grateful that we can work with CEPAS and the University for Peace, La Universidad para la Paz, in a regional topic that is quite relevant today. No, but not just only in the region, in the Caribbean, in South America, in Latin America, but clearly is one of the most pressing humanitarian crises in the world. However, the political divisions in the country, even the political confrontations within the region has changed perhaps the perception of what's going on. And only the huge humanitarian crisis that evolved from the movement of Venezuelan people to the neighboring countries is creating a perception about what's going on in the country. The main topic of this event is itself very complex because the Security Council has addressed the topic of Venezuela many times. However, the very peculiar structure of the Security Council and the veto issue has difficult the objective to build up a sustainable solution. Some countries, the US, France, and the United Kingdom, has proposed solutions that have been blocked by either China or Russia, depending on the occasions. But also different agencies and different special rapporteurs, depending on the area of topic, have even created some different perceptions about the conflict. Even the International Criminal Court, that is not a body that we are using today in this event, is addressing the situation in Venezuela. So I'm pretty sure that the great roster that we have for this event, the speakers and the organization, it will provide us a very comprehensive view of the topic. I'm afraid I was not able to participate live in this very moment. I'm flying back to Costa Rica. Sudden change on the schedule in this pandemic world that is very difficult to plan in advance. But I'm pretty sure that the conclusions and the debate will be a good evaluation, a good analysis of the situation. And I'm pretty sure that I will read the conclusions and to watch later on the recording of this wonderful event. I would like, before I conclude, to express my gratitude to the team that has organized these events, especially Maria Teresa Garrido, Professor Maria Teresa Garrido, the team in UPs and the team in CEPAS that open this space. On our side, we are open to continue the analysis of pressing topics of the world agenda in the region, in the Americas, but also around the world. Please enjoy this event and feel free to use this as an academic space to exchange. Enjoy.
Okay, so those were the words from our Dean of UPs, Juan Carlos Sainz. And I'm just going to introduce our panelists for today. We're very excited about this group of very prepared people who decided to join us, and thank you for joining us. We will start with Dr. Cecilia Bylette. She is a lawyer. She's a professor and director of the Master Program in International Law and co-director of the Research Group on Human Rights in Conflict, Peace, and Security Law. She's from Argentina, but she has been living in the US and Norway, and where she works now at the University of Oslo. She researches transnational and cross-disciplinary issues within international law, including general public international law, human rights, refugee law, Counterterrorism, Gender and Women's Rights, and Peace. Actually, her latest book is the Research Handbook on International Law and Peace, and she has been following the Venezuelan crisis for a long time. So Cecilia, the floor is all yours, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I hope you enable me to share my screen so I can give my presentation. Can you see my screen? Yes? Okay, are you able to see this? Yes, okay, great. Thank you to CEPAS. I think this initiative is incredibly timely and so necessary. The presentation I will make today seeks to give you an overview of how we got to the point we're in at present, in which we see a Security Council that is stagnated and a general state of insecurity as to what is the way forward in terms of achieving a durable peace in Venezuela. So this is part of a larger research project that I will be presenting in Max Planck in September. And what I did was I went through the transcripts of the Security Council meetings on Venezuela, and I tracked the different narratives of peace that were being presented by the different states. Now, you remember the United States actually called for an open meeting, not a closed meeting, an open meeting on Venezuela after they had attempted to address the issue in the Permanent Council of the OAS. The OAS Permanent Council had called for new elections in Venezuela. And so the United States took that as an opportunity to go to the Security Council and in an open meeting, address the situation in Venezuela. So the meeting opens with over 40 states participating, which is in and of itself is quite noteworthy, that there were many states that were actually very, very interested in the situation in Venezuela. And Rosemary DiCarlo is the UN Secretary for Political Affairs, and she commences with giving a big overview of the extensive, systematic, flagrant human rights violations in Venezuela, the mass flow of refugees, the dire humanitarian situation. And she articulates this notion of the right of the Venezuelan people to live in peace. And this is the first articulation we have. This is a collective right of the society itself. Following her presentation comes the United States. It was Pompeo who gives a narrative in which he links the right to democracy to peace, saying that a violation of the right to democracy in the sense of irregular elections is a threat to regional peace. And this presentation is then backed up by several states, both in Europe and in Latin America, who give a type of ultimatum that the Maduro regime should have 8 days to call elections or Guaido will be recognized. Following that perspective is the view that the exodus of refugees, the mass flow of refugees in the neighboring states of itself should be considered the threat to peace. And this is voiced by Germany, by Belgium, but also by Canada, and interestingly enough, Kuwait. Following that is the opposing perspective that is presented by Russia, China, Venezuela itself, and Guatemala, that the threat to peace is external, that the threat to peace is this attempt to instrumentalize the Security Council to attempt to have a regime change. And in addition, raising the issues of the unilateral economic sanctions and the freezing of funds. So you have an opposite perception of how do we define the threat to peace? Where is it coming from, internally or externally? And you have this interesting moment where Venezuela actually challenges the UK to release the gold, right, to the Maduro regime so that they can buy humanitarian aid. And the UK representative answers that the government does not instruct the Bank of England, that they don't have the power to release the gold. So you end up actually getting the UK Court of Appeals addressing the issue as to whether the Maduro regime or the Guaido group should get the gold. And all of that hinges on to the extent to which the UK recognizes de jure the Maduro regime or the Guaido regime. Following that view is the perception is that you can't have peace without justice. And this is following on all the initiatives that are pursued by the Lima Group, by the OAS Secretary General, and many others to track the violations of human rights and humanitarian law and make a case for crimes against humanity and push to get an investigation by the ICC. Opposing this view is the idea that we can't get justice before peace. And therefore, you have a series of states that say, we can't just look at peace as an end in itself, an aim. We also have to focus on the fact that you cannot achieve peace unless you pursue peace as a means, meaning that you need peaceful dialogue. And when you have peaceful dialogue, this is the way we'll be able to calm tensions and then get to a point where we can then pursue peace as an end in itself. And then the final presentation is this notion of the special character of Latin America with all of its history, right, of interventions from the United States and other actors and internal conflicts. And the decision when these states started turning to democratic regimes, that they would embrace this notion that they will move away from intervention, violation of territorial integrity, and violence. And so you had a whole series of instruments being adopted at the sub-regional level and also at the regional level that say that Latin America, the Caribbean, all of these areas are peace zones, zones of peace, and that this is the supreme value that has to be respected. All of these discourses occur in Security Council meetings in which they are presented almost as monologues and not as dialogues. There's no conversation, there's no attempt to build bridges between the different notions or to identify contradictions, to discuss in an analytical way, how do we move beyond the polarization of these principles? And this culminated with the presentation of 2 draft resolutions. So you have one resolution, which is presented by the United States. And here you see that they are calling for elections, this idea of democracy and peace together, that you can't have peace without democracy. And so they call for the calling of elections, and in that way, you will have peace restored in Venezuela. This resolution was vetoed, right, by Russia and China. The Russians present a resolution, and what are they looking at there? They're presenting this notion of dialogue. They point to a mechanism, the Montevideo mechanism, which is presented as a forum for negotiation and dialogue, and they say this is the way forward. They only get 4 votes in favor, so you have 7 against and abstention. So both resolutions fail, and you don't get a solution either one way or the other. And what happens is that you have other states completely outside of the region who become so frustrated because they feel that the Security Council, pursuant to Article 39, has an obligation to address threats to peace and security, that there is no doubt that the humanitarian situation, the exodus of refugees, all of these situations they're looking at definitely constitute a threat to peace and security, and that they should be addressed. And so Indonesia says we have to look at Chapter 6, where we can look at the Secretary General's good offices and other mechanisms we have for nonviolent dispute resolution. And he's surprised that we had a forum in which you have 40 states meeting and not seeking compromise and not seeking cooperation and not recognizing that plurality is a sign of the times, that we are in an age where we have different ways of looking at problems and that we have to work together precisely in order to avoid falling into the same cycles of violence that have characterized human history. And he blames the Security Council's failure to cooperate as putting us on the wrong side of history. So how do we go forward? Well, remember Rosemary DiCarlo. Where is she now? Her language now is that essentially reiterating basically the Russian perspective that this is a crisis that has to be resolved internally by the Venezuelan people, bottoms up, not externally imposed. And we do have a mechanism within the international system where we say, where the Security Council has failed to live up to this obligation to address a threat to peace and security, the General Assembly can actually call for an emergency meeting or a meeting and address the situation. The last time this was done was in 2018 regarding the Palestinians. So that's one possible area. The most important way we have to address the current situation is immediately find durable solutions for the very many Venezuelan refugees and migrants who are in precarious situations in neighboring states and around the world. And I know Colombia has offered to give a temporary status for about 10 years, and that's a move in the right direction, but we need even more. We need immediately more funding for humanitarian assistance. The levels are insufficient. And then you're seeing a movement by other UN actors like the Special Rapporteur that is addressing that issue of sanctions, of what is the impact of sanctions. And they're saying that the sanctions actually exacerbated the pre-existing crisis that was created by the Chavez and Maduro regimes. And so that we have to relook with the new Biden regime at the application of those sanctions and see how they impact human rights and how we can in a measured way, seek withdrawing them in order to have a real discussion on preserving human rights. And this leads us to also looking at the initiatives that we've pursued regarding peace and justice of trying to get accountability. I think that the dialogue there has to go in a broader way, that focusing hardline on the ICC is something that ended up polarizing the Maduro regime, and that maybe we have to look at other alternative mechanisms, such as truth commissions, alternative forums that have a softer impact that may be more amenable. And as a final reminder of where do we have something in common, well, the Venezuelan regime under Maduro actually voted in favor on the Declaration of the Right to Peace. So there's a statement of values that maybe we can work as a bridge, where Maduro, when he talks about the right to peace of Venezuela, he has used it in the sense of negative peace, of the right to non-intervention, of respect to state sovereignty. But he actually recognized this version of peace, which is what we call positive peace, which talks about the right of the people to enjoy human rights, to enjoy development, and to have freedom from fear and want, to have justice and the rule of law. And the obligation in this document, even though it's a soft law document, but the obligation falls on the state, but also on the international community, so that we have a joint responsibility to ensure that the right to peace, in a broad sense of positive peace, of enjoyment of human rights, is met in real time. And I think that maybe this will enable us to form a bridge that can mend the polarization that we saw in the Security Council. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for keeping the time. This is always a challenge, especially when speaking about Venezuela, that we know that there are so many issues around. I already have a lot of questions. I won't do it right now. We will do it for the end of the presentation, but I want to remind our attendees that if you have any questions, please write it down on the chat or on the box for Q&A, so we can have this dialogue at the end. Now I will move forward with Adriana Salcedo's presentations. Dr. Adriana Salcedo is the coordinator of the Master Program in International Peace Studies and an associated professor in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at UPeace. She's a scholar and practitioner in the field of conflict transformation and peace building, with a focus on conflict, gender, identity, and migration. She actually has a doctorate on conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And for this degree, she conducted extensive research on forced migration, conflict, and the social integration of refugees in the Colombian Ecuadorian borderlands and the inner cities in Ecuador. and she's deeply committed to achieving positive social change through non-violent means and to strengthening social actors, including grassroots organizations, indigenous communities, and minority groups through her research and practice. And I'm pretty sure that with her presentation, she will expand a little bit of what Cecilia was talking about, finding these other ways, finding these other alternatives to the conflicts. So Adriana, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Maria Teresa. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for that. It was a very generous presentation or introduction. Allow me, please, to share my PowerPoint. Okay. Can you see it now? Yes? Okay, great. Well, thank you again. Okay, perfect. Thank you again for the invitation. As Maria Teresa mentioned, I come from a different field. I'm not an international lawyer. I am actually a peace builder, a conflict resolver, somebody who comes from a perspective that tries to encompass grassroots peace building, middle range peace builder, and also the top-down or diplomatic negotiations in order to achieve peace. And you will see that as reflected in my presentation today. So I'm very happy to be here and share my views with you on the alternative paths or potential paths for democratization in Venezuela. So basically the main question that I departed here is, what do we do when a country and its people cannot overcome the political deadlock in the UN? That's basically the biggest question, and perhaps you already have some, alternatives in mind. So my presentation today is an invitation to explore and engage in different paths towards democratization, not necessarily thinking from the top down. When we talk about peacemaking or the art of, brokering a deal in international studies, in peace studies, the process of brokering the end of a conflict using diplomatic means is usually the more common path. However, during the last, I would say, 50 years of scholarship, we have devoted to design and research different alternatives to these top-down approaches. So what is called non-official diplomacy. So that eventually may help to complement official talks, or sometimes in some conflicts, deep-rooted conflicts that actually the ones that have triggered the resolution of the conflict and have helped diplomatic parties to, advance towards peace. So that's what I would like to explore, that option of having a multi-track diplomacy and engagement in the Venezuelan conflict, which is actually already happening. And also the second path is the path of the strategic nonviolent resistance and actions, which is something that also is happening in Venezuela. That can help us to go again, overcome the trap of UN and international negotiations that may be tainted by political variables. As Cecilia mentioned already, there have been numerous attempts to intervene in Venezuela from different bodies. I mean, we can remember a series of dialogues and negotiations by different countries and conflict interveners, organizations, individuals, etc. So we can recall early interventions by UNASUR when it still existed, and of course the OEAs, and more recent ones by Norway, Uruguay, and Mexico. Grupo de Lima, which, as you know, is formed by a lot of or many Latin American countries plus Canada. And I would say the latest one is the Grupo Internacional de Contacto por Venezuela, the GIC, formed as a European initiative with countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, among others, as well as Costa Rica, Uruguay, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And as you saw, in the case of the GIC, I think this group was born with a clear commitment of let's introduce a democratic solution to Venezuela through free and fair elections. As we all know, that what happened on this regard this past December in the legislative elections. So I don't recall having seen a case in worldwide with, the boycott to an electoral process was so big as in the Venezuelan case in the last elections in December. So all these negotiations, attempts, and dialogue initiatives, good offices by international partners and governors often fail. Or became trapped due to the combination of internal and external factors. So there is a need to of collective brainstorming and thinking of what is next, what is happening in Venezuela, what can we support Venezuela beyond, the institutional processes and the institutional means. In this regard, also we need to pay attention to the context, how the Venezuelan crisis has been happening at least close to 2 decades, as I would say. And in those 2 decades, there have been a lot of changes in the region and internationally. We need to account for those in the dynamic also of the Venezuelan conflict. For example, one of the most recent ones is the creation of Prosur in South America, that actually in 2019, that actually excluded completely Venezuela from this integration mechanism. This could be seen as a resemble of the common mechanism known as the carrot and the stick, but actually it's closing the door for any, I would say, political engagement and negotiation of governments in the region with the regime of Maduro. There has been also the return of right-wing governments into the Latin American region, and particularly in South America, and 2 strategic ones for Venezuela, Colombia and Brazil, that also has contributed to shape the prospects of an understanding in the region. And we still have to see what happens with the newly inaugurated US administration. I think it's too early to see. We need to wait for them to play their cards in the Venezuelan situation. So speaking from a peacemaking perspective, peacemaking efforts should go beyond track 1, so beyond elite negotiations. And this is something that many governments resist, but it's actually is very effective. So how do we move beyond the negotiations that happen at the elite level and try to involve unofficial diplomacy or different tracks in terms of diplomacy? What is called track 2, and for example, also track 3, so grassroots engagement. With this, I don't want to say that track 1 or the official diplomacy is not, it has not been effective. It actually has been very effective in ending or putting an end in very protracted conflicted situations, probably like, Northern Ireland or Bosnia or even Colombia. But sometimes there are failures in terms of legitimacy or in implementation of those provisions that were agreed that actually, work against peace in a way. So that implementation we need to pay attention. And there has been also some, I would say, traumatic experience in terms of international negotiation that we need to learn from, that not have always ended up successfully. And we can recall some examples in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, as we are witnessing today, and also, of course, Venezuela. This is a pyramid by a world famous peace builder, Jean-Paul Lederach, that advocates for this comprehensive approach to go beyond track 1 diplomacy and to understand sectors and approaches and different actors that can actually help to underpin negotiations. This is what we have been witnesses in Venezuela the last few years, with major involvement of diverse set of organizations and actors with different backgrounds, from academics, religious leaders, civil society organizations, I would say, grassroots organizations that have raised their concerns and have managed to, gain some space in raising these concerns, I would say, and their opinions, and making their voices to a certain extent being heard nationally and internationally. The way we envision this as peace and conflict scholars is not a matter of, doing one-track diplomacy or one official negotiation. It's actually a whole scheme of multi-track diplomacy. We cannot concentrate all our efforts or like the saying says, not putting all the eggs in the same basket. So the UN is that basket, and I think we have to diversify the efforts on in international peacemaking. And see international peacemaking as this living system that is connected by different components from the government, business, private sector, education, academia, grassroots groups, activism, etc. So we need to engage and expand the conversation beyond the UN at this point. So that's the bottom line on the first part of my presentation. The second part that I would like to address very briefly, because I'm conscious about time, is the strategic nonviolence actions and resistance and how they have been pivotal in bringing transformation in different conflicts, deep-rooted conflicts around the world. They have proved to be a very successful way around the world to achieve, conflict transformation in different scenarios. In Venezuela, there have been, again, several attempts to start nonviolent actions and campaigns with different results, positive and negative, unfortunately. So one of them that I can mention, a few years ago, La Plataforma Nacional del Conflicto was one of them, and also groups of civil society organizations, students, workers, women associations that actually came together to push forward this platform for actions. There was another interesting example also in the Citizens Bridge, so Puente Ciudadanos, which is this initiative led by local civil society organizations in 8 border cities in the Colombian-Venezuelan border. And the main aim is to enhance coordination, security, humanitarian aid, delivery of humanitarian aid, and promotion of positive engagements. Okay, so that's one example of one of the things of how citizens can engage in transforming. The theory behind this, of course, and the theory and the data, because it has worked in several deep-rooted conflicts, it's the power of nonviolent action lies basically in shifting the patterns of obedience, cooperation, and consent in society, so that you can shift the power dynamic that exists. And that, of course, was a very famous scholar named Eugene Shabchuk who came up with the idea. But researchers took this idea and started developing data sets and analyzing different case studies around the world. I put some there as an example. So India and the Salt March that led actually to the independence of India from as a British colony. Also Chile, which is one of the closest examples that we have in the region. Philippines with the People's Power movement. The US civil rights movement, for example, is another example. And of course, the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia. So researchers used to think that governments will not survive if only 5% of the population are raised against them. And it's actually a number even smaller after several, analysis is 3.5% according to political scientist Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephen in this famous book, Why Civil Resistance Work. So having said this, to think about nonviolent actions in the context of Venezuela can be a very, it can be to ask too much to the Venezuelan people at this point. But I think it's actually an initiative that, or several initiatives that are born within Venezuela in civil society and with the Venezuelans that are actually seeing in the power of nonviolent resistance and action an alternative to all those more structured mechanisms that are not answering their concerns necessarily. I think it's important to mention how civil society, how the people's power function. It's through links to community. So there's no absolutely monologue and monolithic state power. Okay, there's no perfect state structure. States always have cracks, and are those cracks that need to be taken into advantage by the groups of people. So no authoritarian regime survives in isolation. That's the point. And those community links are the ones that we need to start questioning and taking advantage, trying to shift loyalties. And that's what happened initially, if you recall, a couple of years ago, with several members of the Venezuelan army look into or try to search into asylum in Colombia in the failed, Cucuta operation that wanted to deliver humanitarian aid to Venezuelans across the border. I guess the bottom line on this part is we need transition. We need to encompass, resistance, but also we need to encompass dialogue and negotiation to achieve a more democratic and inclusive society. What comes next? As we have seen, I guess the probability of a UN Security Council resolution that favors, an intervention in Venezuela continues to be very low, unfortunately. A domestically negotiated political settlement is also very unlikely in light of the current political situation. And hopefully I'm wrong with this, and hopefully my colleagues here have a different opinion that brings some light into this more pessimistic view. And although there's a leverage of external parties that may increase the odds, of negotiations taking place. If we add the complexity that we're living now with, the economic meltdown in the country, the food insecurity that exists, the massive displacement of Venezuelans in the region and in the world at this point, and the pandemic. So those are critical factors that we need to factor in our analysis. So it's not only about the engagement of these multiple strategies. I think it's only about when we manage to engage these multiple strategies that we will eventually see some, level of transformation, conflict transformation in Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, for leaving us with that very important question. I think that's the question that we all have here. What comes next for Venezuela? Should be the UN Security Council? Should be Venezuelans? That's one of those big questions that we hope we can at least start answering a little bit, as you mentioned. But thank you for your presentation. Now, I would like to introduce Mr. Richard Gohan. He oversees the Crisis Group Advocacy Group at the United Nations. He's liaising with diplomats and UN officials in New York. Richard was previously a consulting analyst with ICG, and in between 2016 and 2017, he has worked with the European Council of Foreign Relations, with the New York University Center on International Cooperation and the Foreign Policy Center in London. And he is also a scholar. He has taught at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and Stanford in New York. He has also worked as a consultant for organizations including the UN Department of Political Affairs, the UN Office of Special Representative of the Secretary General on International Migration, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So he has a vast experience not only on diplomacy, but also with the UN and other actors. So Richard, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join you too. What I will do is, I think, come back to the UN angle that Cecilia was discussing. Firstly, Cecilia helped me a lot state of time, because her discussion of the Security Council discussions in 2019 covered some ground that I was going to touch on. But I will say a little more about what's been happening in the Security Council recently on Venezuela, because although there have been no public council discussions of Venezuela since 2019, there have been a number of closed door discussions. And my colleagues and I at Crisis Group in New York have some idea of what went on in those. So I think I can add some useful details on more recent council dynamics around Venezuela. Then I will say a few words really about the other UN tracks for engaging with Venezuela that we've been following over the last year or two, including the work of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and discussions linked to Secretary General Antonio Guterres about whether there is any more that he could do politically in this crisis. And as you know, there has been some criticism going back a few years that Guterres has been too cautious in personally engaging in the situation. So I want to try and sort of unpack what we think his calculations are and how they may develop. And I will close with some remarks about what we as Crisis Group think the UN could do vis-a-vis Venezuela in 2021. So to start with the Security Council track, Cecilia described the big events of February 2019 when the US and Russia tabled dueling resolutions on Venezuela and both failed for the reasons that she described. I think it's worth emphasizing, although Cecilia pointed to this, that everyone knew that debate was going to be a failure. The US approached the Security Council primarily, I think, as part of its campaign of maximum pressure against Maduro at that time, which had many other features, such as John Bolton signaling that there might be a possibility of a military intervention and so forth. The US resolution, which Cecilia outlined, was actually quite deliberately moderate in its phrasing in a call for elections. But it was clear from the get-go that the call for elections would trigger a Chinese and Russian veto. And to some extent, the US came to the council to discredit the council by showing that constructive diplomacy was not possible with the Chinese and Russians. And so they brought a resolution that was ultimately meant to fail and duly failed. At roughly the same time, Elias Abrahams, the then US Special Envoy for Venezuela, was putting quite a lot of pressure on UN officials, including, I believe, Guterres, telling them that he did not want to see a bigger UN role in the crisis. And so actually, although the US was making a case for a democratic transition, our understanding was really that the US was actually attempting to cut the UN out of this process, which fits with what the US was doing on other crises in 2019. For example, in 2019, the US blocked British efforts to have the council play a bigger role in Libya. You had an administration at that time with people like Bolton and Pompeo who really just didn't see the UN as part of their conflict strategy in most places that they cared about. Continuing the maximum pressure approach, I think it was April 2019, Vice President Pence came to the council and infamously announced that the US was going to try and have the Maduro government de-recognized. The Maduro government's diplomats de-recognized as representatives of Venezuela. Now that initiative went nowhere because it ran into complexities around the UN Credentials Committee. But again, it was really about making noise and trying to increase public pressure on Maduro rather than trying to find a resolution to the problem. And at that time, quite a few observers, including us at Crisis Group, basically said stop. This campaign of public meetings meant to humiliate Maduro is not leading anywhere. And actually what we were seeing was that some countries like Germany, who initially had actually been very supportive of the US approach, were starting to get cold feet in mid-2019 and feeling that they were trapped in an unproductive diplomatic offensive in New York that was not going to succeed. And so actually for most of 2019 into 2020, into the period of the pandemic, the Council stayed silent on Venezuela, despite the continuing crisis. Once we get into the pandemic period, I think it was sometime last summer, a number of Council members, including the Europeans, did try to restart conversations on Venezuela, but they did so behind the scenes using various meeting formats, allowing for private discussions. And the European approach at that point was really just to raise the humanitarian crisis and bring home to Council members that although they had not been discussing Venezuela for some time, the humanitarian situation was very serious. Now, and that followed on from what Cecilia was pointing out, that I think Belgium, Kuwait and others have been emphasizing in public. That was the narrative they were continuing. This was a humanitarian challenge. This backfired, and it backfired because the Russians and Chinese seized on the opportunity, called for some more meetings of the Council themselves, and in those meetings basically pushed a narrative which we understand was as follows. Yes, there is a humanitarian crisis. The humanitarian crisis is, however, primarily the result of US sanctions. And so if members of this Council want to ease the suffering of people in Venezuela, the first step should be to end all unilateral sanctions against the country. And in doing so, they also embarrassed the Europeans by conflating US sanctions and EU sanctions on Venezuela, which irritated the Europeans because the Europeans feel their own sanctions are more targeted and more nuanced than those of the US. And this Russian-Chinese narrative was not a huge surprise, to be honest, because they had been saying very similar things about Syria. And actually in the course of last year, on a number of occasions, on a number of crises, the Chinese and Russians brought out this sort of argument against US sanctions, and also argued that in the context of the pandemic, there was a humanitarian case to end universal coercive measures, be it against Venezuela or Syria or elsewhere. And this actually resonated with quite a number of Council members. We had in the Council last year countries like Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, all of which, to a greater or lesser extent, actually, supported the Russian-Chinese line on the evils of sanctions. And you saw a dynamic emerging that was a little more reminiscent of the Cold War Council, where you had big non-Western countries in the Council, siding broadly with China and Russia to criticize the US and Europeans. So that sort of behind the scenes effort to keep Venezuela on the Council agenda actually probably was less, it was less beneficial than the Europeans had hoped. There was also, I think, a Council meeting after that rather weird mini invasion effort, which was also an opportunity for China and Russia to make fun of the US. Since then, we've heard nothing. We don't have any indication from the Biden team if they're going to touch on Venezuela in the Council. Clearly, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the US ambassador to the UN, was only confirmed yesterday. The US has a very heavy load of early priorities to deal with in the Council, peacekeeping priorities and so forth. So we're not envisaging a very early return to Council diplomacy around the situation. And although South Africa and Indonesia have now left the Council, I think you would find there are countries like India, St. Vincent and the Grenadines still, Vietnam still, that would continue to, I think, broadly, with some reservations, but be broadly skeptical of Western intentions on Venezuela at the UN. So that's where the Security Council track lies. And I think it will take some time to undo, frankly, the damage that the Trump administration wrought in 2019 with its maximum pressure approach through the UN. On the Human Rights Council, sorry, the Human Rights Commissioner, Bachelet, here I think we have a disappointing story. Bachelet, of course, went to Venezuela in mid-2019, I think June 2019, to establish a human rights presence. And for a time, I think she succeeded in developing one of the few channels for UN communication with Maduro and his supporters. And I think that was actually a successful piece of quiet diplomacy by Bachelet. The problem is that the reporting that has been coming out of Venezuela, that Bachelet has been presenting in Geneva, has cast the government in a very, very poor light, emphasizing human rights abuses in Venezuela. And that has closed down discussions between, political discussions at least, between Bachelet and Maduro's camp. So I think credit to the High Commissioner for opening the channel, but that channel seems to have got blocked. Which leaves the question of who else can speak for the UN in Venezuela and work on behalf of the UN in Venezuela. Now, it is true that Guterres could have been more active on Venezuela. He has been more outspoken on other crises in the past years, such as that in Myanmar. But our understanding is that really from the beginning of his term, Guterres looked at the crisis in Venezuela and worried that if he engaged early, if he offered to mediate himself, he would follow the many, many other actors, the Pope and so forth, who have engaged in the crisis, failed and lost credibility with the parties. So the Guterres strategy has always been to wait, to see if others, such as the Norwegians, could find some political solution to the crisis, and then to step in to see if the UN could provide impartial support to the implementation of whatever political agreement was made. So, for example, in 2019, when there was a hope that it might be possible to get to free and fair elections, Guterres was holding back, arguing that the UN could step in to support the election process if it ever became possible. Now, I think that was in many ways a sensible strategy. It was one that we at Crisis Group were sympathetic to at the time, in contrast to many other NGOs. But of course, the problem that Guterres now faces is that, as Adriana and Cecilia had said, there really doesn't seem to be any chance of a political solution emerging which the UN could support. And so I think now Guterres and the UN secretariat face the question of could the SG and the secretariat be more proactive even in the absence of council engagement. There are rumors that Guterres is considering appointing an envoy for the crisis. Normally, the SG has to get quiet approval from Security Council members for envoys dealing with conflict situations, but it is possible to appoint a personal envoy who doesn't require that sort of approval. That's the current case in Mozambique. And so Guterres could appoint a personal envoy to reach out to the parties and try and see if there's any more room that the UN could play. That may be attractive at this point too, because the former UN resident coordinator, the development and humanitarian chief in Caracas, has recently stood down. I think that individual faced quite a lot of criticism for being too close to Maduro. So there is a bit of space now for Guterres to appoint a new resident coordinator and maybe a personal envoy to engage in Venezuela. However, our reading is that that would not be offering to mediate the crisis. In essence, it would probably be more about trying to put some high-profile figures in charge of improving the humanitarian situation and creating some frameworks for some of the more grassroots discussions that Adriana was describing. So that's the latest that we've heard. But the UN's options, I think, remain very narrow unless the Biden administration does down the road make some fairly fundamental changes to its approach to the crisis.
Thank you, Rachel, for opening this panorama for other UN bodies. I think it's very interesting. We already have some questions. But before presenting the questions from our attendees, I would like to just start with a big question for the three of you. Because Cecilia added in her slide the DAG-HAMA score, I don't know if it's the right pronunciation, sorry for that, about the role of the UN. Should the UN be saving humanity from hell? And I think this relates to the idea of this narrative of peace that the three of you has been speaking about. So the main quote is like, is this the role of the UN? And my question, just to start this conversation, is what is hell? Who gets to decide it? Because for Venezuelans, we are in this humanitarian crisis that looks very much like hell. But should be Venezuelans the ones deciding it, as Rosemary DiCarlo suggests, or should be the Security Council, as the UN Charter actually suggests? Because I think this narrative will change the whole perspective on who gets to decide what, and then we could move forward with the nonviolent communication or nonviolent protests, or just addressing the UN Security Council, or just looking for other options. So I would like to know your ideas on this. Who gets to decide? What is health? Should be Venezuelans, should be at the UN level? Like, what are your thoughts on this topic? Any of you can start. Maybe you can just unmute yourself and that will be okay.
Well, I mean, let me just respond to that quickly, which is to say that I think Adam Roberts, a great scholar of the Security Council, about 15 years ago, described the Council as a selective security institution. The reality is that, contrary to the impression of the Charter, the Council has, always picked and chosen which crises it wants to deal with. Even though council members have often recognized that there are appalling crises that, for geopolitical reasons, they do not feel the UN should touch. And so I don't think that one can look to the Security Council and expect an objective decision that, Venezuela has reached a point of hellishness where action is absolutely necessary. I would also say that something we've seen in recent years in other crisis situations is actually the permanent members of the Council try and litigate what is hell. So if you look at Syria, everyone agrees it's an appalling situation. Everyone agrees there has been chemical weapons incidents in Syria, but Russia has spent a lot of Security Council meetings saying that actually it's not the government that uses chemical weapons. It's opposition forces. And so, really quite basic facts about what's going on in conflicts are in question. And I think that's the game that I was describing Russia and China playing over the nature of the humanitarian crisis, with China and Russia sort of basically arguing that the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is America's fault. So it's not the question of is it bad, it's also who has the responsibility for it being bad. I mean, one thing I would say for, all those who care about Venezuela, and I would say this actually with regard to a number of other crises too, is that you do have to think about the narrative in the Security Council at the moment. I think your point there is absolutely right. I think that it is important to try and talk to the elected members of the Council in particular, and try and offer them, objective narratives about what's going on in the country. Because otherwise you get very shallow appreciations of the situation, which say it's all America's fault, or frankly, it's all China and Russia's fault. And I think council members don't have the level of detail and level of knowledge of what's going on inside Venezuela to really evaluate those opinions objectively. So I mean, I would urge you, and it's something that obviously we as Crisis Group try and do a lot, is to try and get facts to council members, talk to council members, often do so privately, so they have a better grasp of what's going on.
Thank you, Richard. I don't know if Cecilia or Adriana would like to add something.
I think that the approach that Adriana was coming with of moving outside of the formal mechanisms to the informal mechanisms of giving more protagonism to civil society actors is the UN approach at present. And for that Declaration on the Right to Peace, it wasn't just the state and the international community meeting the UN, it was the international community meeting also civil society actors and NGOs, that all the output coming from human rights institutions, the new forms of collective human rights that we're seeing, which include peace, are contingent on this idea that the duty of implementation of peace requires a broad approach that is moving beyond the original institutions that we created, at the end of World War II. We're somewhere else now. And so it is the need to think creatively to be able to lift us out of hell today.
Thank you. Adriana, I don't know if you would like to add something, or should I move to the next question?
My problem is that I got disconnected and missed the question. So I am kind of, weaving the opinions of my colleagues.
Worries. Because actually the next question is from our attendees, and it relates a little bit to what we were discussing, because in this idea of finding a different solution, opening a different track, as you were saying, on these diplomatic tracks, and you mentioned the nonviolent resistance. And Romina Troconis actually highlighted the point that in Venezuela, this has been very common. If you see all of the reports of people protesting and going to the street, this is a constant. And the problem is right now that people are tired. People are not participating. People are just looking to cover basic needs. So the question basically is, would you think of another way to approach the peace solution with this generalized negative feeling of people about civil resistance and this tiredness and all of the associated things that goes with the tiredness?
Thank you, Maria Teresa, and thank you, Romina, for the question. I think that's one of the dangers of engaging with nonviolent action and resistance when it's not very well planned and strategically done. It can, play against the main objective of this. So probably that's one of the, factors that contribute to those sense of, I guess, despair among the Venezuelans who have been engaged in nonviolent actions. If I see other ways and possibilities of engagement, I see multiple ways, and that's part of my paradigm, put it that way. I mean, I don't see one engagement. I think peace requires a multi-stakeholder effort from different fronts, whether it's the UN, whether it's civil society, whether it's neighboring countries. And in order to neutralize those spoilers for peace, and in order to, come up with a more comprehensive agreement on what the country needs and move forward towards those needs. But I definitely think that that's something that has to be done by Venezuelans. Otherwise, we're going to end up with another conflict if ever this solution happens. So I think it's a way to encompass the right intervention, the right methodology, the right practice, whether if it's nonviolent resistance, strategic resistance, or action, whether if it's a UN intervention, and come up with a comprehensive set of tools to engage with the situation. I think there have been windows of opportunity in the past that were not taken into full capacity by the opposition, a very fragmented opposition in the country, and also by international players that are actually invested in finding a resolution to the Venezuelan conflict. So I think that fragmentation didn't contribute to advance towards a most peaceful agenda. Also, I think I want to highlight who's the convener on this, because it's critical for any, peacemaking effort to have a legitimate convener in any dialogue or any negotiation effort. And that has to be legitimate to the Maduro regime, legitimate to the Venezuelans and to the international community. So who is that person, who's that group, who's that organization is a question that, we need to answer. As I mentioned, I listed several, groups, governments, individuals even that have wanted to, play that role, but critically they lack something in the formula. I guess the way I see the conflict at the state where it is right now, I don't see that moment will come soon, unfortunately, for the Venezuelan people, unless there's something really drastic happening, a drastic, change in the strategy of the international community engagement in Venezuela. I don't see that window of opportunity happening in the near future, unfortunately. I don't see the ripeness needed for negotiation at all.
Thank you, Adriana. Although a little bit pessimistic at the end, I kind of agree with you. I think a solution is not on the site right now, and this is part of the questions that we have been having right now. Like, we are in this dichotomy between Venezuelans deciding, international organizations, body trying to decide. So I will read some of the questions because we are almost on time, and then you can comment on any of them. The first one is from Emma Faris, and she speaks about the sanctions, if they should be revisited. Specifically, she asks, how can we be sure that bad actors and entities in Venezuela will use their wealth, resources for the good of their populations? And this is always a question when we review sanctions imposed by any government or to any government. And then we have another question, kind of in the same idea of involving different actors, from Eleanor Openshaw. And her question is, what do you think the US should do in regard to Venezuela? And this is a little bit of what you were discussing, this difference between Biden and Trump and all of the discussion. And what would that in turn enable the UN to do? And this is part of the main discussion on the role of the UN Security Council, especially. And then we also have another question from Keith Mines, and it's more into the idea of the civil society organizations. How can be there more involved, how that demand for peace can be actually presented by NGOs, and he actually, or she, I don't know, sorry. Can you comment on many of the various initiatives that are in play in this regard, the civic forum hosted by the Diálogo Social and Fede Cámaras, efforts by Reunificados, Los Ciudadanos? Do these efforts have the potential to make a difference in moving the parties to a peaceful resolution to the conflict? And is this between civil society, track, diplomacy in different levels? So again, like the mic and the floor is open to any of you to comment on any of these, of the sanctions, the role of the US, the civil society. So I don't know who would like to start.
I guess I can talk a little bit first, and then I'm sure Richard wants to jump in. But for sanctions, I think they exist, right? And Richard was talking about the lack of differentiation between the US and the EU one. So there we have capacity now to measure impact of sanctions, right? And we can show the different impact on human rights of the different types of sanctions. And so because they exist and we are able to measure them, we are able to use that as a negotiating tool, that if we are going to remove certain sanctions, we would like to see a corresponding change in relation to the protection of human rights, et cetera. And this is something that we can use to build peace, right? So I see that as something that we can explore exactly in a creative way, using the different capacities we have both in technology and social science in order to enable us to have more knowledge about how to remove them in an intelligent way to get change. And then my pet peeve is the fact that we have these protracted crises that the crisis group discusses all the time. Syria and Yemen, Kashmir, protracted crises that have gone on for decades, where we have displacement of people who never achieve a durable peace in their lifetime. They are floating, and we have tremendous family separation. We have Venezuelans where the children went to Chile, the parents went to Spain. I think that would be my #1 priority for the UN, is to enable the families to be reunified and to have some sort of durable peace, some sort of right to have professional and personal aspirations while we figure out the thing in Venezuela, because every day that goes by, they suffer with the pain of separation, which is, for me, the crime against humanity is the separation of these families.
I mean, if I would jump in there, I would say, I think we would fully agree that under any circumstances, the immediate priorities do have to be the humanitarian needs of Venezuelans inside and outside Venezuela. And I think we're entering a pretty tough period in the humanitarian business, simply because budgets are going to be very stretched in this COVID recession period. How long and how serious that will be, we don't know. But I think that it is very important for to keep pressure on donors and on host governments of refugees to allow family unification where possible and so forth. And I think that looking into Venezuela, our view remains that the #1 priority is trying to get an agreement with Maduro's circle about expanding humanitarian access into the country, especially in the context of the rollout of vaccines, but not only in the context of the rollout of vaccines. So, I mean, those are the priorities. However, there is always the risk, as you say, Cecilia, that we end up easing the pain of a crisis, but not solving the cause of the crisis. But at the moment, we think those mitigating maneuvers are essential. In response to Eleanor's question about what the US could do, I mean, our understanding is that this debate is at a very early stage in Washington. This is not, unlike Yemen, for example, a situation where the new administration has come in signaling major change. Indeed, Blinken signaled continued opposition to Maduro. I think there are still debates ongoing about whether to have an envoy for Venezuela, similar to the envoy that was appointed for Iran. I think a lot is still open, and I don't know where the US is going to come out. But again, we hope that there will, under any circumstances, be an appreciation of the humanitarian crisis, and also, frankly, the reputational dangers for the US associated with the continuation of that crisis, whether it's fair or not. In terms of messaging and the work of Venezuelan civil society, I think, again, I would just come back to the point I made in my first my first response in the Q&A, which is I think that the more clear factual reporting that NGOs can bring to the UN system, the better the UN system will perform. I wouldn't actually say, just to finish, that Venezuela is a situation where civil society is not being heard around the UN. You want to find a situation where civil society is not being heard, you look at the Western Sahara or you look at the Central African Republic, where there's virtually no civil society discussion in New York. There is civil society discussion around Venezuela in New York and Geneva. But I think that precisely because it's been such a dramatic crisis for so long, maybe some of the voices are not being heard as well as they should be. So I think working on, very targeted messaging, very fact-based messaging, focusing on members of the Security Council, elected members such as Norway and Ireland, and really making sure that they are getting messages to other council members about the realities on the ground is very important at this stage.
If I may just speak on what Richard was mentioning, the last comment on civil society involvement, I think that's precisely the role of the international community can play here by strengthening those civil society organizations in Venezuela and of Venezuelans, of the Venezuelan diaspora that are actually closer to probably the global north, and the spheres of power there that they can be more influential. So I see the role, a pivotal role of support and strengthening of international actors and international governments in creating those platforms for resistance and awareness and so on. As I mentioned before, the role of the US, I guess, in this crisis, it's too early to say what it's going to be the Biden administration, a strategy on this and how if he attempts to break this, relationship that resembled a mini Cold War struggle within the Security Council. So that's something that we still need to see and analyze better. With the issue of the sanctions, I am very cautious there because I think sanctions at the end of the day, although unintentionally ending hurting people and people on the ground. And I think probably that's what is happening in Venezuela in terms of food security and, just securing some of the basic needs in everyday life. So I think we need to look more at the effect of sanctions in different crises around the world. And I think, for example, Yemen is a good example of this and Venezuela is another one. Thank you, Maria Teresa.
Thank you, Adriana. We have here Vivi from CEPAS, and I think it will be very good just to ask her to say some words about this initiative from civil society, because this forum is actually one of those. So Vivi, if you can comment, I know we are on time, so.
Yes, thank you, Maria Teresa, and thank you for the question, because this is also, as you say, related to all the work that we are doing nationally and internationally for find the solution to the crisis in Venezuela. And I just want to let you know that civil society is very active in this field of peace building. We have a very difficult environment to do that. And it's also very difficult to talk about this in Venezuela. Words like dialogue, elections, agreement, are like a seems to say that there, but we are working on this. We are working with all the political actors that has in their hands the chance of change and find solutions in Venezuela. And our center to do this work are human rights. That is the way that we can do all the different actions, also the mobilizations and the protests, and also the conversation with different actors. When we are centered in our pillars, we feel secure in this very difficult moment, and we are talking about this and asking as a third party, asking questions about the dignity and the solution for people. And we know that the solutions are in different times. The humanitarian situation is urgent and it needs to be resolved in this moment, but also we are asking for the political solutions that take time to reveal all the political rights, but also we are working on that. And we are connecting this early solution or early agreements with a goal, a main goal. We call that the Acuerdo Democrático Nacional, the National Agreement, Democratic Agreement, and also it have the letters of ADN or the ADN that is why Venezuelans are made for. We are democratic people, we are faithful people, and we think that ourselves, we can, with the help of the international community, we can build our peace in Venezuela. And I think it's important in this conversation, that is international conversation, let you know that that is happening in Venezuela. Even all the uncertain and all the, we think sometimes we lose the hope, but when you see what is happening locally, people working, people building, peace building, you think that Venezuela has future and we are building. And thank you for the question.
Thank you, Vivi, for this more optimistic note. I think it's very appropriate because we're at the end of the forum. We actually took a little bit longer, but I want to thank you all for your ideas. I still have a lot of questions that I couldn't ask, and I'm pretty sure our attendees also had the same, because it was a very interesting presentation. The three of you spoke about different issues that we are still need to decide in Venezuela, that we need to get involved. But before finishing, I think it would be nice just to say that with CEPAS, we are also thinking about what Richard mentioned, like how we can provide more information to the UN bodies, how we can do that. And we are working on a project, it will be an essay contest, just to bring this idea to the academic level, to involve more the youth in creating this alternative for peace, in presenting information. So we hope to send you more information about this contest and what will be the content of the essays. So you can participate, you can distribute it among your network, because we believe that this is a very important issue that we need to address. There is a need of more specific data and accurate information to present to international bodies. Like creating this environment in the more academic perspective is very needed. And this is one of the attempts to do it. So thank you for participating. Thank you for joining us. And before we finish, I don't know if any of the CEPAS representative would like to say some words or. Yeah.
I don't know if you meant me, Maria Teresa, but just very quickly to thank obviously the panelists and the attendees. This is conversations that we want to keep having. We definitely see some efforts, as were described, from civil society to bring this more to the New York level. What we wish to do is to bring this all together and make sure that, although it is not very positive as we look into addressing the Venezuelan crisis in 2021 and moving forward, it is an imperative as well. The worst thing that could happen is to think that Venezuela is an unsolvable crisis and the international community disengage because of that. So we'll keep working, so stay tuned.
Okay, so thank you. I guess with that, we can close this event. Thank you all for participating, for joining us. The record will be available on YouTube, on CEPAS channel, and later on the UPeace channel. And if you have any other comment, just let us know, write us. And thank you again for joining us. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
That will be all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.